It started with a photo, a single image meant to symbolize joy, unity, and the beginning of a life together. A photo taken to mark a milestone, shared with loved ones, and preserved as a memory of one of the happiest days imaginable. It was a moment frozen in time, capturing smiles that spoke of hope, promises that felt unbreakable, and the kind of love that everyone dreams of finding. For the past several weeks, a wedding photo is a cherished symbol, something to look back on with pride, something to share as proof of a bond meant to last forever. It was supposed to be no different for them. But in the days that followed, that photo began to take on a different meaning. What started as a simple gesture, a post on social media, a celebration of a new chapter, slowly became something else entirely. Conversations behind closed doors grew more intense. Questions were asked that didn't have easy answers. Smiles once filled with warmth became tight, forced, and uneasy. Words were exchanged, sharp enough to leave wounds no one could see. And as the days went on, what seemed like a new beginning for this couple began to crack under the weight of something far more complex than anyone on the outside could imagine. At first, the tension was subtle, hidden in plain sight, disguised by the pleasantries of newlywed life. Friends saw them and thought everything was fine. Family believed they were simply adjusting to their new roles. But within the confines of their home, the very bond they had celebrated just days before was beginning to unravel. All of it led to one moment, one decision, one horrifying act that no one could have predicted. A moment that turned a celebration of love into a tragedy that would leave an indelible mark on everyone connected to it. And at the center of it all was that photo, a single image, a harmless act that should have been nothing more than a shared memory. Instead, it became a catalyst, one that would ignite emotions so intense, so uncontrollable, that the consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of their home. How could something so simple lead to something so unthinkable? How could a love story that began with so much promise end in such devastation? These are the questions that remain, haunting everyone who thought they knew them. Questions that lead us to uncover not just what happened, but why it happened. Welcome back to Echoes of Crime, where the past speaks and the truth demands to be heard. I'm honored to have you here as we delve into another gripping case. To my returning subscribers, thank you for your unwavering support. It means the world to me. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story. Now, let's dive in and uncover the echoes that refuse to be silenced. Let's begin by understanding the two lives at the heart of this tragic tale. Lives that on the surface seemed so different, yet became intertwined in ways that would ultimately lead to disaster. Her name was Margaret Wells. At 60 years old, Margaret had lived a life full of quiet accomplishments and profound challenges. A retired school teacher, she was the kind of woman who found joy in simple things. Her days were filled with gardening, reading her favorite novels, and baking treats she would often share with neighbors. She was known for her generosity, always ready to lend a helping hand or offer a kind word. To those who knew her, Margaret seemed content, the picture of resilience after a lifetime of ups and downs. But behind closed doors, Margaret struggled with a deep loneliness. She had been widowed for over a decade, losing her husband to a sudden illness. They had shared a long and happy marriage, and his absence left a void that nothing seemed to fill. Margaret tried to move on, throwing herself into volunteer work and hobbies, but as the years went by, the quiet of her empty home became harder to bear. In recent years, Margaret had taken a leap into the unfamiliar world of online dating. It wasn't easy. The platforms felt foreign, the interactions often shallow, and the results disappointing. She met a few people, some kind, some indifferent, but none who stayed. Still, she pressed on, driven by the hope that somewhere out there was someone who could make her feel alive again. That's when she met him. Daniel Harris was 35 years old, 25 years Margaret's junior. To someone like Margaret, he seemed like a dream come true. Daniel was charming, attentive, and full of compliments. He told her she was beautiful, that she was special, that he had never met anyone like her. These were words Margaret hadn't heard in years, and they had a profound effect on her. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen. Daniel's life, however, was far less idyllic. He had a troubled past marked by instability and conflict. He bounced from one job to another, never staying in one place for long. His relationships were volatile, often ending in dramatic breakups fueled by jealousy and control issues. Financially, Daniel struggled, often living paycheck to paycheck or relying on the generosity of others to get by. Despite these warning signs, Margaret was captivated. Daniel represented everything she had been yearning for: companionship, affection, and the promise of a future shared with someone who cared about her. She overlooked the red flags, the quick temper, the controlling tendencies, the mysterious gaps in his stories. She told herself that everyone has flaws and that love, real love, could overcome anything. Their relationship moved quickly, much faster than Margaret's friends and family were comfortable with. Within a few months, they were engaged. Margaret's friends voiced their concerns, worried that Daniel might not have the best intentions, but Margaret dismissed their fears. She believed in Daniel, in the man he could be, in the happiness they could have together. The wedding was a modest yet joyful event. Margaret wore a simple but elegant white dress, and Daniel stood beside her, beaming as they exchanged vows. The ceremony was intimate, with only a small group of friends and family in attendance. For Margaret, it was a day of pure joy, a fresh start, a new chapter. One of the photos taken that day captured what should have been a moment of happiness. Margaret and Daniel standing side by side, their arms around each other, smiling for the camera. Margaret later posted this photo on her social media account with the caption, "A new chapter begins." To most, it was an innocent act, a way to share her happiness with the world. But for Daniel, that photo became something else entirely. To understand Daniel's reaction, we need to delve deeper into who he was. Daniel was not just insecure, he was a man consumed by a need for control. Throughout their relationship, he had established himself as the dominant figure, dictating everything from Margaret's wardrobe to how she spent her time. Margaret, eager to please and desperate to hold on to this newfound love, often acquiesced. But the photo was different. Margaret hadn't asked Daniel's permission before posting it. To her, it was a simple celebration of their union. To Daniel, it was a breach of his control. Daniel's anger over the photo was rooted in more than just a need for dominance. It was tied to secrets he had worked hard to keep hidden. Unknown to Margaret, Daniel had been involved with several women before their relationship, some of whom he was still in contact with. He had carefully avoided letting anyone from his past know about his marriage, fearing it would expose his lies and jeopardize his connections. When Margaret posted the photo, it shattered Daniel's illusion of control. He accused her of disrespecting him, of humiliating him in front of people who might see the post. He demanded that she take it down. But Margaret, for once, stood her ground. She had done nothing wrong, and she refused to let Daniel dictate this small act of happiness. This defiance, though small, was enough to send Daniel into a downward spiral. His accusations grew more intense, his anger more volatile. The photo became a fixation, a symbol of everything he believed Margaret had done to undermine him. What had started as a joyful moment, a simple photo meant to celebrate love, was now the center of a storm that neither of them could escape. And as Daniel's rage continued to build, it became clear that the story of their marriage would not have a happy ending. The days following the wedding should have been filled with celebration and bliss, a time for Margaret and Daniel to settle into their new life together. But instead, tension began to creep into their interactions almost immediately. At first, it was subtle. Daniel became unusually quiet, withdrawing from Margaret in ways she hadn't seen before. She noticed him staring at his phone for hours, his face a mask of irritation. When she asked if something was wrong, he brushed her off with vague responses. "I'm fine," or "Nothing you need to worry about." But Margaret wasn't fine. She sensed the shift between them, the growing distance, and it gnawed at her. She tried to reach out to him, to rekindle the warmth they had shared before the wedding, but her efforts were met with coldness or impatience. And then came the arguments. They began over trivial things, small disagreements that quickly spiraled out of control. One night, Daniel snapped at Margaret over a misplaced set of keys. Another time, he accused her of spending too much time on the phone with friends, insinuating she cared more about them than their marriage. Margaret was confused and hurt. She couldn't understand why Daniel was behaving this way, why their happiness seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Then came the Facebook post. The wedding photo Margaret had shared online continued to fuel Daniel's growing anger. Every time he saw it, his temper flared. He claimed the post was disrespectful, that she had no right to share their private life without his permission. But Margaret knew it was more than that. One evening, Daniel let slip what had been festering in his mind. He accused her of posting the photo deliberately, to mock him, to embarrass him in front of others. He hinted that the post might be seen by people who shouldn't see it, though he never elaborated. Margaret, exasperated, asked him outright, "Who are you so afraid will see it? Why are you so upset about a picture?" Daniel's response was chilling. "You wouldn't understand." As the days passed, Daniel's fixation on the photo intensified. Margaret began to notice subtle but disturbing changes in his behavior. He became more secretive, guarding his phone and spending long hours scrolling through social media. She overheard him muttering to himself, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense. "They'll see. They always see. Can't let it happen." Margaret, desperate to salvage their marriage, tried to reason with him. She offered to take the post down, but Daniel dismissed her efforts. "It's not about that anymore," he said cryptically. What Margaret didn't know was that Daniel's paranoia ran far deeper than she realized. The photo had been seen by someone from his past, a former girlfriend who reached out with a message. Though Margaret never saw the message, Daniel's reaction was immediate and volatile. He smashed his phone against the wall that night, accusing Margaret of ruining everything. "No," she said, and then her voice faded away. His erratic behavior didn't stop there. Daniel began posting strange messages on his social media accounts, vague but ominous statements like, "Some things can't be undone. Trust is a fragile thing. Silence is the only way to keep peace." Friends who saw these posts reached out to Daniel, concerned for his mental state, but he ignored them. The arguments between Margaret and Daniel escalated. Friends and neighbors began to notice the tension. One neighbor later reported hearing raised voices late at night, though the words were indistinguishable. The night of the crime started like any other. Margaret cooked dinner, trying once again to ease the growing distance between them. Daniel barely touched his plate, his eyes fixed on the photo Margaret had printed and framed. A gesture she thought would make him happy. Instead, it seemed to infuriate him. The final argument began over that very photo. Margaret, exasperated, finally confronted Daniel. "Well, can't you just let this go? It's just a picture, Daniel. You don't understand what you've done," he shouted back, his voice shaking with rage. The shouting grew louder, more heated. A neighbor, alarmed by the noise, called the police, reporting a loud and violent argument next door. When the police arrived, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were on, but no one answered the door. Inside, what they found would haunt even the most seasoned officers. The call to the police came at 10:47 p.m., a neighbor reporting screaming and loud crashing sounds from Margaret and Daniel's home. The officer who responded first described the scene as unsettling even from the outside. The porch light was on, but the curtains were drawn tightly, obscuring any view into the house. The only sound was the faint hum of an air conditioning unit. After repeated knocks went unanswered, the police forced their way in. The door creaked open to reveal a home that seemed untouched on the surface. No signs of a struggle in the entryway or living room. But as they moved further inside, the officers began to notice odd details. A chair tipped over in the kitchen, shattered glass glinting under the dim light, and smeared red marks on the floor leading toward the bedroom. The trail of blood led them to Margaret's body. She was found lying on the floor, partially obscured by the bed. Her injuries were brutal, indicating a ferocity that spoke of uncontrolled rage. The room was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, the frame of the infamous wedding photo shattered on the ground. The glass from the frame had been used as a weapon, its jagged edges stained. The details of the scene painted a chilling picture. This was not an act of impulse. It was an explosion of violence born out of deep-seated anger. Margaret's injuries suggested she had fought back, but she was ultimately overpowered. For the officers on the scene, the discovery was both horrifying and surreal. Just days earlier, Margaret had been a smiling bride, filled with hope and excitement for the future. Now, she lay lifeless in the home she had shared with the man she thought she could trust. Daniel was found in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His hands were covered in blood, his eyes vacant. He didn't resist when the officers approached him, nor did he attempt to explain himself. He simply muttered under his breath, over and over, "I told her not to do it." The officers described his demeanor as chillingly calm, almost detached, as if he were an observer in his own life rather than an active participant in the events that had just unfolded. When they cuffed him and led him to the patrol car, he didn't ask any questions, didn't show any signs of remorse or panic. At the station, Daniel's behavior shifted. During questioning, he oscillated between silence and defensiveness. When asked why he had killed Margaret, his responses were cryptic. "She didn't listen to me. She knew what she was doing. I told her to take it down, but she wouldn't." The detectives pressed him for specifics, trying to understand his motive. Over time, a picture began to emerge. A dark and deeply troubling portrait of a man unraveling under the weight of his insecurities and need for control. Daniel revealed that he had felt humiliated by Margaret's decision to post the wedding photo. To him, it was more than just a picture. It was an act of defiance, a public declaration that undermined the image he had tried to project. He admitted that he had been terrified that the photo would be seen by women from his past, women who might expose his lies or bring his secrets to light. But there was something else, something even darker. Daniel saw Margaret's act of posting the photo as a challenge to his authority, a refusal to submit to the control he had worked so hard to establish. To him, it wasn't just about the photo, it was about power. As the interrogation continued, Daniel's composure began to crack. He shifted blame onto Margaret, claiming she pushed him to it by refusing to take the photo down. His statements became increasingly erratic, veering between self-pity and anger. The investigation revealed that Daniel's actions were the culmination of a dangerous psychological unraveling. His relationship with Margaret had been built on a foundation of control, with Daniel using his charm and manipulation to dominate her life. But the wedding photo disrupted that dynamic. It was a small act of independence on Margaret's part, but to Daniel, it was a threat, a reminder that he couldn't control everything. Compounding his paranoia was the fear of exposure. Investigators found messages from women Daniel had been involved with in the past, some of whom had reached out after seeing the wedding photo. These messages, innocuous on their own, fueled Daniel's insecurities and heightened his need to regain control over the situation. Daniel's actions were not the result of a sudden snap, but rather a slow and steady buildup of resentment, paranoia, and a toxic need for dominance. His inability to cope with even the smallest challenge to his authority led to a horrifying act of violence that left Margaret dead and shattered the lives of those who loved her. The crime scene, Daniel's erratic behavior during questioning, and his disturbing admissions all painted a clear picture of his guilt. But for those who knew Margaret, the questions remained. How could this have happened? How could someone who claimed to love her have committed such an unthinkable act? In the days that followed, the photo that had started it all circulated once again, this time as part of news reports covering the case. What had once been a symbol of hope and new beginnings had become a haunting reminder of the tragedy that unfolded in its wake. Daniel's trial would bring more revelations, but for now the world was left grappling with the sheer horror of what had transpired. A love story turned nightmare, all because of a single photo. The trial of Daniel Harris began just months after Margaret's murder, drawing widespread attention from media outlets and true crime enthusiasts alike. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and members of both Daniel's and Margaret's families. For weeks, the case dominated headlines, as every detail of their ill-fated marriage was dissected in public view. Daniel pleaded not guilty to the charges of first-degree murder, his defense team arguing that the act was not premeditated, but rather the result of a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by emotional distress. They painted a picture of a man who had been pushed to his limits, claiming that the couple's arguments had created a volatile emotional state. The prosecution, however, presented a starkly different narrative. They described Daniel as a controlling, manipulative individual whose need for dominance had escalated into violence. Evidence from Margaret's friends, neighbors, and the couple's social media accounts painted a clear picture of his growing paranoia and aggression in the weeks leading up to the murder. Key testimony came from a former girlfriend of Daniel's, who testified to his pattern of controlling behavior in their relationship. Her chilling account of emotional manipulation and threats mirrored the dynamics that had unfolded between Daniel and Margaret, strengthening the prosecution's case. The most damning evidence, however, came from Daniel's own words. The prosecution presented his social media posts, his search history, and recordings of his interrogations, which revealed a man consumed by jealousy, fear, and an insatiable need for control. During the trial, Daniel's demeanor was cold and detached. He rarely showed emotion, even when graphic details of Margaret's death were presented. When asked if he regretted his actions, he avoided the question, instead shifting blame onto Margaret, claiming she should have listened to me. After weeks of testimony, the jury took less than a day to reach a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Daniel to life in prison without the possibility of parole, stating that his actions were the result of a calculated and egregious abuse of trust. News of the trial and verdict sent shockwaves across the country. People were horrified by the details of the case and the senselessness of Margaret's death. Vigils were held in her honor, with friends and former students gathering to remember the woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness. Online, the case sparked intense debate. Many expressed outrage at Daniel's behavior and the tragic consequences of his need for control. Others questioned the dynamics of their relationship, pointing to the significant age gap between Margaret and Daniel as a possible factor in the power imbalance that defined their marriage. Social media became a battleground for discussions about the dangers of toxic relationships, with countless posts warning others to recognize the red flags of controlling behavior. Some users shared their own stories of manipulation and abuse, using Margaret's tragedy as a catalyst for raising awareness. The role of social media itself became a focal point of the conversation. Many questioned whether the pressures and visibility of online life had contributed to Daniel's paranoia and eventual unraveling. The wedding photo that had sparked the tragedy became symbolic of how something as simple as a social media post could carry unintended consequences. Over time, Margaret's story became a case study in true crime circles, dissected and analyzed by experts and enthusiasts alike. Documentaries and podcasts explored every aspect of the case, from Daniel's psychological profile to the societal factors that might have contributed to the tragedy. The case also prompted broader discussions about the risks of online dating, particularly for older individuals like Margaret, who may be more vulnerable to manipulation. Advocacy groups used the case to promote awareness of relationship abuse, launching campaigns to educate people about the warning signs of controlling behavior and the importance of setting boundaries. In the years following the trial, Margaret's friends and family worked tirelessly to honor her memory. They established a scholarship fund for young educators in her name, ensuring that her legacy of kindness and dedication to teaching would live on. For those who followed the case, Margaret's story was both a cautionary tale and a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly love can turn into something dangerous. Her life, once defined by resilience and warmth, became a rallying cry for those fighting to prevent similar tragedies. As time passed, the infamous wedding photo resurfaced periodically in news articles and documentaries, a haunting image of a moment that should have been joyful but instead became the prelude to a nightmare. It served as a stark reminder that behind every picture lies a story, one that can be far darker than it seems. She rose serenely from her chair to face the band. As we reach the end of this story, it's impossible not to wonder, could this tragedy have been prevented? Or was it doomed from the start? Margaret Wells was a woman full of hope and resilience, seeking companionship after years of loneliness. Daniel Harris was a man whose charm masked a dangerous need for control and dominance. Their lives collided in a whirlwind of romance that quickly turned dark. Was it Margaret's unwavering optimism that blinded her to the red flags? Or was Daniel's manipulation so calculated that no one could have seen the danger ahead? Margaret was one of two things. She was either a moral liar, or else she was badly deceiving. Perhaps the warning signs were always there, hidden in his volatile past, his controlling tendencies, and his inability to accept vulnerability. Perhaps, as some have argued, the dynamics of their relationship, a significant age gap, emotional power imbalances, and the vulnerabilities of online dating made this a tragedy waiting to happen. And what about the role of social media? Could the pressure of public perception, the fear of exposure, and the permanence of a single post have amplified Daniel's insecurities to a breaking point? The questions linger, haunting those who knew Margaret and those who have followed her story. What we do know is this: Margaret's death was not just a singular act of violence, but the devastating result of a toxic mix of manipulation, paranoia, and unchecked rage. But this is only one story in a world filled with countless others. If you thought this story was chilling, wait until you hear about the case of the bride who disappeared on her honeymoon, an unsolved mystery that left investigators baffled and the public terrified. We want to hear from you. What's your take on this tragic case? Could it have been prevented? And what lessons can we learn from Margaret's story? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others who might benefit from hearing it. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping true crime story. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant.